Hello to everyone. And I think Colleen still has her video on, so we'll get with you all in just a moment. There we go. Let's see. My name is Ann Wright, and I am the moderator of this excellent panel that we have with you. Let me just ask, can you all see me on the main screen, or is it still Colleen on? Just so folks know, Jules is another staff member. Okay. Can you see me on the main screen, or is it still Colleen's flower?
We see you, Ann. All my stuff is off.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, again, it is a real pleasure to be with you all here at the Veterans for Peace virtual convention. The second time we've been forced by COVID to have our convention, our excellent convention, virtually, but we do seem to get a lot more, maybe not a lot more attendance, but a lot of attendance this way. And we're so glad that you all are here with us in this plenary session of the convention, a plenary session that's very important on the issue of the dangers that are going on in the Western Pacific and in Asia. A great deal of US aggression and NATO aggression, and we're pleased to have some excellent speakers in this panel. I want to acknowledge that Veterans for Peace, through its Korea Peace Campaign and the China Working Group, have members of our own organization that are doing a lot of work on this. So please, if you're interested, join up with either one of those groups. We encourage everyone to mention in the chat who you are, where you're from. But if you have some specific questions for our panelists, if you will put them in the question and answer box so that we can get to them a little better. We do have our panelist, KG Noi, will have to leave soon after he does his presentation. So if you have some questions for him as he's doing the presentation, be sure to put them into the question and answer so we can get him to answer the question before he leaves. Christine Ahn will be staying with us toward the end of the hour, but please put some questions in for her, and we'll catch her before she leaves. So with that, we will begin our panel of 5 people that represent issues in Hawaii, in Korea, in China, in Guam, and in Australia. And our very first speaker is from right here where I am, which is in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's Dr. Kyle Kajihiro. He's a professor at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, and teaches courses in ethnic studies and geography and environment. He's also the co-founder of the Hawaii Detours Project, which aims to teach people the true history of Hawaii and spread awareness of social justice issues from a decolonized perspective. He is an authority on the militarization of Hawaii. Kyle's PhD thesis was on the Hawaiian island of Ko'olawe, which had been bombed for decades by the US military and was finally returned to the people of Hawaii because of courageous citizen activism. He's a board member of Hawaii Peace and Justice. Kyle, please go right ahead.
Aloha kako. Warm greetings and solidarity from Kanaka Maoli lands in the US occupied Hawaiian Islands. I want to thank Ann Wright, Colleen Kelly, and for the invitation to speak with you all. And also the Veterans for Peace for all the amazing work that you do for being a voice for peace and social justice. And thanks to my fellow panelists, it's an honor to be with so many rock star activists. So I hope I do everyone proud. Let's see. So let me, if I could share my screen here. Can y'all see that all right? Okay. So in 2011, when the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit met in Honolulu, President Obama and Secretary of State Clinton unveiled the administration's big foreign policy decision, the so-called Pacific Pivot. It called for a rebalance of US military and political power from Europe and the Middle East to the Pacific region. Meanwhile, representatives of civil society groups and social movements in Hawaii, Asia, and Oceania met in a parallel event called Moana Nui. Moana Nui means the great deep ocean. It was a recognition of the oceanic connections which nurture our solidarities. Several hundred of us marched to Waikiki to deliver our message to APEC delegates, only to be met with barbed wire and armed patrols. Waikiki had been turned into a militarized green zone. The media gave extensive coverage to Obama's policy announcement, but those of us protesting outside knew that the pivot was nothing new. The United States pivot to the Pacific began in the late 19th century when US military and political leaders looked across the Pacific Ocean and with desire for China's riches. Today, China continues to loom large as the United States' central obsession, but this time as a military and economic competitor. Despite pledging to downsize US foreign military commitments, the Trump administration continued Obama's pivot and even dredged up racist yellow peril themes to fire up his supporters. And the pivot continues with the Biden administration and the US Indo-PACOM's $20 billion regain the advantage wish list to counter what it calls the hyper-competitive rivalry with China. Every pivot needs a fulcrum, the stationary point upon which a lever turns. A fulcrum does invisible work, excuse me, by magnifying the force applied to the lever, which enables it to lift heavy objects. Hawaii has been and continues to be an important fulcrum of the United States Pacific pivot. Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge here lays out most clearly the imperial ambition driving this move. The Pacific Ocean is our ocean. The power that rules the Pacific is the power that rules the world, and that power is and will forever be the American Republic. But in order to achieve such a goal, military planners set their sights on Hawaii. They needed stepping stones to get across the Pacific Ocean. And between 1872 and 1873, General John Schofield led a secret military survey of the Hawaiian Islands, posing as tourists, with orders to identify a suitable location for a naval coaling station. He reported, it is, quote, "It is the key to the Central Pacific Ocean. It is the gem of these islands, valueless to them, to native Hawaiians, because they cannot use it, but more valuable to the United States than all else the islands have to give." The geographic feature described by Schofield was Keawalau o Pu'uloa, the original name for what people today know as Pearl Harbor. It is a broad estuary fed by streams and springs from the Ko'olau and Waianae mountain ranges. Because of the abundant fresh water, shallow sunlit bays, and fertile soils, it was a major food producing area for Kanaka Iwi on Oahu. They called it Aina Momona, or fat or abundant land for the agriculture and aquaculture production. Unfortunately, today, most people only know this place as a sign of war. In order to access Keawalau Pu'uloa, US officials conspired with white settlers to land American troops to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani in 1893. President Cleveland considered it an act of war against a peaceful and friendly nation. According to historian Stephen Kinzer, Hawaii was the United States' first regime change. Despite two successful campaigns by Hawaiian nationals to defeat a treaty of annexation, the Spanish-American War in 1898 gave the United States the opportunity to seize Hawaii as a wartime necessity without a legal transfer of sovereignty or the consent of the Hawaiian people. The militarization of Hawaii expanded with each subsequent war, reaching a high point of military landholdings during World War II. In 1947, the Pacific Command was founded, now the US Indo-Pacific Command, which is the oldest and largest of the unified commands. Its area of responsibility spans more than half the surface of the planet and encompasses most of the world's population, going from the west coast of North America to the central Indian Ocean, and from Alaska all the way to and including the entire continent of Antarctica. The Hawaiian scholar and activist Kaleko Ka'eo asked the nuclear-free and independent Pacific delegates in 2007 to imagine the military in Hawaii as the head of a monstrous he'e, or octopus. The head of this he'e is approximately 142 military sites encompassing nearly 225,000 acres of land, 60% of which are the occupied Hawaiian national lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom. On the island of Oahu, nearly 25% of the island is occupied by the US military. The brains of this octopus can be thought of as the command center, the supercomputers, and the fiber optic network nervous system that connects everything together. The eyes of this he'e are the military radar installations and space tracking facilities on various mountaintops, which enable it to see. These include Space Force Tracking Station at Haleakala on Maui, missile defense radars at Kaena Point and Koke'e on Kauai, the multiple roving eyes, including drones, satellites, and the giant sea-based X-band radar, which periodically docks at Pearl Harbor. The ears are a network of listening devices arrayed across the islands, including the National Security Agency's Regional Signals Intelligence Center under former pineapple fields near Wahiawa. This is where NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden worked before exposing illegal government spying on electronic communications of its citizens. The excrement of this he'e consists of the multitude of negative military impacts on the environment and society. These include nearly 1,000 military contamination sites at active and former military bases. These sites contain a toxic cocktail of depleted uranium, unexploded ordnance, chemical munitions, heavy metals, solvents, and petroleum products. The Navy's Red Hill fuel tanks were built during World War II and have leaked hundreds of thousands of gallons of jet fuel over the years. 20 of these giant underground fuel tanks, deteriorating and leaking with a capacity of 12.5 million gallons each, are perched 100 feet above an aquifer, which supplies 25% of Honolulu's drinking water. It's a ticking environmental time bomb. The excrement of the he'e also includes the destruction of cultural sites and resources, the taking of land, and the suppression of civil liberties. This is a golf course at Kaneohe Marine Base, which is one of the largest Hawaiian burial grounds in the islands. It includes the taking of civil liberties and land, the forced cultural and political assimilation of Kanaka Iwi and other peoples in Hawaii, various accidents, violence against women, the economic dependency on military spending. The military spends approximately 7.8 billion per year, or 9.8% of Hawaii's GDP. And so while some get paid handsomely in the military economy, others pay the price. In particular, Kanaka Iwi pay the highest price in terms of lost sovereignty, land, culture, and economic opportunities. And the tentacles of this he'e reach out across the Pacific to grasp at islands and peoples within this region. These include military bases in Guam, the Northern Marianas, Okinawa, Japan, the Marshall Islands, the Philippines, Korea, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Australia. At many of these sites, powerful social movements oppose US military bases and activities. However, as fishing people know, when the tentacle of a he'e is severed, a new one can grow in its place. For example, in the Philippines expelled US bases in 1992, but US troops returned under George Bush's global war on terror to assist with counterinsurgency operations in Mindanao. And more recently, with China's aggressive military buildup in the South China Sea, the US military has expanded its access and use of Philippine military sites. After the 1995 rape of a 12-year-old Okinawan girl by US Marines, resistance to US bases erupted in Okinawa and forced US base troops to realign its base and force structure. This led to new coral reef destroying bases in Okinawa, the destruction of limestone rainforests and cultural sites in Letexan in Guam, and expanded troop rotations in Australia, as well as a 2,700 troop increase in Hawaii. As Kalekoa reminded NFIP delegates in Tonga, the best way to neutralize an angry, writhing he'e is to bite it in its head, or to use less violent imagery by neutralizing its destructive powers. So in Hawaii, we've had two sets of kuleana, or responsibilities, to confront the violent militarization of the land and people here, but also to counter the consequences of military activities and wars that emanate from Hawaii and affect people throughout the region. So one of the seminal struggles was the Kaho'olawe movement, which began in 1976 and it succeeded in 1990 to stop the bombing of Kaho'olawe Island. This movement based on the idea of Aloha Aina, to love the land, to care for the land, spread to Makua Valley on Oahu, which is an ongoing struggle that we have. It also has moved to Pohakuloa on Hawaii Island, right at the base of Mauna Kea. And one of the campaigns we're engaged in right now is to end 4 leases that the US Army has with the state of Hawaii, encompassing 30,000 acres at Pohakuloa, Makua, Kahuku, and Puamoho. Each of these leases is $1 for 65 years, and they end in 2029. So we're in a campaign right now to try to stop that. Also, the Rim of the Pacific exercises, or RIMPAC, are the largest multinational exercises that happen every 2 years in Hawaii, alternating with the Talisman Sabre in Australia. So we've joined forces with movements in Australia to oppose and protest these war games. And this is just what happens with RIMPAC at some of the sites. So I want to just close with this image of kipuka. The Hawaiian word kipuka means an opening or an oasis. It can be a forest in the middle of a lava field that becomes a source of new life. And so kipuka aloha aina are these openings of struggle, of resistance, and of new futures that emerge in times of these social movements. The Mauna Kea movement on Hawaii Island was a kipuka aloha aina. And like the forested kipuka, they spread seeds which then regenerate life on the lava field. So I just want to close with the image of, let us join for, let our kipuka aloha aina from our various islands regenerate hope, life, and struggle for peace and justice that threaten to, the monstrous he'e, which threatens to devour our region. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kyle. That was an excellent, excellent presentation on what is going on here in Hawaii. We thank you very much, and for all your activism. Kyle is one of the most active of all of our folks, and has been for many, many years, as he was the director of the American Friends Service Committee office for Hawaii and the Pacific for many years, until unfortunately AFSC had to close some offices. So thanks so much, Kyle. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Well, the overview from Hawaii and the Indo-Pacific Command, the military command, we'll move to one of the countries that is most affected by US militarism, and that's Korea. And we're asking Christine Ahn to tell us about efforts on for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Christine is the founder and executive director of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War and ensure women's leadership in peace building. In 2015, she led 15 international women peacemakers, including myself, across the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, from North Korea to South Korea. We walked with 10,000 Korean women on both sides of the DMZ and held women's peace symposia in both Pyongyang and Seoul. And let me just say, it was pretty darn remarkable. Christine is the international coordinator of the Korea Peace Now transnational campaign, which Women Cross DMZ launched in 2019 with 3 other feminist peace organizations. She's the recipient of the 2020 US Peace Prize in Peace Building for her bold activism to end the Korean War, to heal from the wounds of the war, and for women's leadership in peace building. Christine, please go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you, VFP. I see so many names in the chat: John Kim, Ellen Barfield, Pete Doctor. There's so many of you that have dedicated so much of your life for peace, but also especially ending the Korean War, which is the longest standing US conflict. And I'm just so honored to be on this panel with Kyle, Lisa, and our new friend from Australia. I feel that more than ever, being here in Hawaii, being in the Pacific, that this is a region that we really must build and organize together with. I think it's time for a second Moana Nui conference once we're out of this pandemic, because of the conflict between the US and China, which KJ, we're so honored to have him too, will provide a lot of insight. So I know we don't have too much time. And so I actually wanted to share a video of that actually was produced by VFP member Will Griffin that was shown this spring on a webinar that we did on the US ROK military exercises. For many of you who know, the Korean War never officially ended. It was only halted with a ceasefire in 1953. And so that has meant that for the last 71 years, a state of war has existed between the US and North Korea. And despite efforts between North and South Korea to make peace and reconciliation, oftentimes that has been quashed because of the US position and the US seemingly permanent occupation of South Korea with 28,500 troops across 80 military installations and bases. In fact, Ellen noted in the chat that she was based in Pyeongtaek, which we saw in Kyle's presentation, which is the world's largest military base. And so Korea, obviously, and the Korean War and the conflict with North Korea is used by the US, as we saw during the Bush administration under the axis of evil, has been used to maintain US military presence throughout the region. So ending the Korean War is vital to achieving peace and security throughout the Asia Pacific region. So in fact, you know, many of you know that there were historic overtures that were made with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea with Kim Jong-un. And that led to some really historic declarations that were signed, the Singapore Agreement between the US and North Korea, and the Panmunjom and Pyongyang declarations in 2018 between North and South Korea. And unfortunately, much of that progress was quashed. We can thank John Bolton for doing that, and obviously the lack of serious diplomacy by the Trump administration. And so we are at a pivotal moment. There is a new administration with the Biden administration. He has pledged to have pragmatic diplomacy with North Korea. And we have the final year of the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in. And so this is a critical moment. And there was no communication between North and South Korea in the last year. And actually, on the anniversary of the armistice, North and South Korea revived the hotline. And unfortunately, that hotline has since been shut off in the last 2 weeks because of what? The US ROK military exercises, which are taking place right now at this very moment and continue on through next week. And so that is the focus of my presentation today, because I do believe that Vets for Peace, as one of the strongest anti-war peace veterans organizations, like, we really need your help in really trying to push the Biden administration to stop these war games. And so I'm going to quickly share a video that Will Griffin made that I think just captures it really well, why these are so provocative and must end. So let me see if I can do full screen, and here we go. Oops, did I not? All right, forget the full screen. Here we go.
Civil society organizations in the
Oh no. Is it freezing?
Yeah, Christine, sometimes folks have a hard time showing a video from the internet when their Zoom is running. If you want to send me the link, I can try and share screen because I have a higher speed internet.
Okay, sounds good. Let me send that to you really quickly. Sorry about that, everybody. I'm just going to put it in the chat right here, Colleen. Okay, well, maybe while Colleen loads the video, I'm just going to make my points that followed the video. And I think it's a really important video because I think you can see how provocative and dangerous they are. But I want to make 3 points about the war games. One is that as we try to resolve the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, we have to address the root cause, which is the unresolved Korean War. And as we urge the US, South Korea, and North Korea to bring closure to this war by replacing the ceasefire, the armistice, with a peace agreement, there are interim steps that can be taken to create the conditions to support diplomatic engagement. And canceling these military exercises is actually a concrete way that past administrations have taken to advance negotiations. For example, during the Clinton administration, in reaction to North Korea's announcement that it would produce weapons-grade plutonium, the Clinton administration actually almost conducted a preemptive strike on North Korea's nuclear facilities in Yongbyon. And as part of negotiations to de-escalate tensions, the US canceled the team spirit exercises. This was essential for preventing a military conflict with North Korea, which then led to the 1994 signing of the agreed framework, which succeeded in freezing North Korea's plutonium for 8 years, which prevented them from actually producing about 100 nuclear warheads. So suspending the military exercises is actually a very effective adjustment that the US can make without undermining quote unquote military readiness. Number 2, contrary to the prevailing message from past administrations, including the Biden administration, that these military exercises are defensive in nature, they're actually provocative, costly, and they actually raise tensions instead of deterring North Korea. In fact, there was a recent study that came out from Stanford University that shows that North Korea responds to these war drills with belligerent behavior because they are perceived as a legitimate threat. And so they invite a reciprocal demonstration of North Korea's resolve. So given the devastating consequences of a potential military conflict on the Korean Peninsula, this is a US congressional research study that said that if in the opening days of a conflict, 300,000 people would instantly die. And that were nuclear weapons to be used, which we know North Korea has as the US, up to 25 million people would be impacted. So as a policy goal, the US should do whatever it can to mitigate the threat of a war. And so one question that I think we often get is, well, if the Moon administration really wants to make peace with North Korea and these are in the way, South Korea is doing these military exercises with the US. Why doesn't Moon stop that? And it's a very complicated response, but basically the US still has wartime operational control over South Korea. This is the 10th largest economy in the world. It's the 6th most powerful military, and yet the US controls wartime operations over South Korea. And the challenge is that the goalpost for transferring that wartime operational control keeps changing. Under Roh Moo-hyun in the 2000s, the US was supposed to give back wartime operational control, and that did not happen. And so part of what qualifies South Korea to resume back its military control, which really it never has since the Korean War, is set by the US. And it includes their ability to have deterrence capability against North Korea. So that is part of the reason why the Moon administration feels like they have to continue, is so that they can basically yield control from the United States over its own military under wartime. And so my last point is that in order for negotiations to bear fruit, the US has to take a peace-first approach. All other efforts have not failed. Maximum pressure in the form of sanctions, these military exercises, and political isolation has not worked. And so the Korea Peace Now campaign just came out with this report this spring. It's called Path to Peace, the case for a peace agreement to end the war. And I do believe that when we work together, especially across the region, and including vets from Vets for Peace, that we can, with a broader coalition of multi-generational Korean Americans, humanitarian aid organizations that have been on the ground in North Korea, and our broader peace movement, that we can end this war. And there are some exciting signals that Washington is shifting. And one is, of course, a new resolution that was introduced by Brad Sherman, who is considered a national security Democrat. He's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And this is a bill that builds on House Resolution 152 that in the last Congress, Ro Khanna introduced, which we got 52 co-sponsors to sign on to. And it's exciting to me that there are now more voices in Washington calling for an end to the Korean War with a peace agreement. And so what do you think, Colleen? Do you think we can show this short video?
Yep, she said she's ready.
Okay, so that's the conclusion of my talk. Enjoy the video. Thank you, Anne and everybody.
Thank you, Christine.
All right, I'm gonna start it now.
Civil society organizations in the United States, South Korea, and around the world are calling on President Biden to suspend the annual US-South Korea combined military exercises. Suspending these costly and highly provocative war exercises will be a crucial step towards restarting genuine diplomacy with North Korea. It will remove a formidable obstacle to a peaceful resolution of the ongoing 70-year-old Korean War, and allow all parties to focus on other important global issues facing our nations today, such as creating a nuclear weapons-free world and resolving the current COVID-19 pandemic. In the mid-1950s, just after the Korean War, the US and South Korea began combined military exercises that prepare for war with North Korea. In the 1970s, the drills developed into large-scale exercises that mobilized considerable weapons, equipment, and the deployment of US troops stationed in both South Korea as well as US bases outside of the Korean Peninsula.
2 U.S. infantry divisions stand ready to back up the South Koreans. Close to the DMZ, astride a traditional invasion route to Seoul, is our 2nd Infantry Division, geared for instant action.
Since the 2000s, these exercises have been based on operation plans that reportedly include preemptive strikes and decapitation measures against the North Korean leadership. Due to their scale and provocative nature, the annual US-South Korean combined exercises have long been a trigger point for heightened military and political tensions on the Korean Peninsula. For years, these combined military exercises have involved the use of B-2 bombers, which are designed to drop nuclear weapons, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, as well as the firing of long-range artillery and other weapons. They not only increase tensions on the Korean Peninsula, they have cost US taxpayers billions of dollars and have caused irreparable harm to local residents and the environment in South Korea. At a time when the world is facing urgent humanitarian, environmental, and economic crises, these military exercises divert critical needed resources away from our capacity to provide true human security, such as healthcare, a sustainable environment, and other priorities. Furthermore, they heighten geopolitical tensions and risk reigniting a hot war on the Korean Peninsula, which would have catastrophic consequences for millions of people. The civil society organizations in the US and South Korea and around the world are saying peace talks, not war drills and military confrontation. They urge the Biden administration to resolve the root cause of the conflict between the United States and North Korea, the unresolved Korean War, which has driven a dangerous arms race, harmed the most vulnerable people through punishing sanctions, and enforced the tragic separation of hundreds of thousands of Korean families. Continuing to rely on isolation, pressure, and threats to force North Korea's unilateral denuclearization is a recipe for failure. Suspending the combined military exercises will be a major confidence-building measure towards renewing diplomacy to resolve the long-standing 70-year-old conflict with North Korea and ultimately achieve permanent peace and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula.
Well, thank you very much for showing that, reminding us, Christine. We thank Will Griffith for his excellent video. Will is a remarkable videographer and putting things together, and does a lot of work with the Global Network for keeping space free of nuclear weapons, as well as Veterans for Peace. But again, Christine, thank you so very, very much for that presentation on Korea. Our next speaker is going to talk about the U.S. confrontation with China in the South China Sea. KJ Noi is a South Korean independent scholar based in the United States. He's a journalist and educator who specializes in the geopolitics of Asia and in issues of global security and health. He has reported extensively on great power competition, geostrategic messaging, and the media ecology and its effects on communities. He's collaborated with various scholars on the geopolitics of global health, indigenous health rights policy, structural violence, and medical care delivery under neoliberal capitalism. His latest article is one that we all are interested in, and we'll put this into the chat. It's called The Neglected Role of the Military as a Disease Vector, Implications for COVID-19 and for the Global Public Health Policy. Thank you very much for being with us, KJ. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to be with everybody here. Just a brief comment regarding the article. This was something that I worked with a team of researchers at York University at their public health department, and we were trying to understand why areas such as Guam, Okinawa, Hawaii, Korea had contained COVID, but were suddenly seeing large outbreaks. And we were able to correlate and also show causation in certain cases that these were related to US deployments, because troops can travel and bypass screening and visa control and public health measures. So I invite people to look that up. And I'm going to go right ahead and do my presentation piece here, which is about the escalation to war in the South China Sea. So, as you all know, currently the US is escalating to war. There's no kind way to put this. And we're currently in a kind of a pre-kinetic phase or a subkinetic phase, which is largely characterized by hybrid warfare and information warfare. But to go through, we have to really understand a little bit of the global scene and also a little bit of the history. So the West has had a long history with China. The US adopted a yellow peril trope fairly early on. This was a German colonial war trope. And then, of course, the US was also involved in the Opium Wars. And eventually, about 10% of China's population were addicted to opium. But this was a windfall for the United States. The great American fortunes, the East Coast fortunes, and the Ivy League institutions were built on this drug trafficking. So essentially, there has been a long history of race war against China and the Chinese. And we know that from the early 20th century, late 19th century, where we saw mass lynchings of the Chinese. The largest massacre, the largest lynching in US history was actually against the Chinese. And where I live, not far from where I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, the residents of Antioch burned down a Chinatown. But even before that, the Chinese had been digging tunnels under the ground because they would be lynched if they were found walking on the streets after sunset. And so this is where we get the term a Chinaman's chance. Of course, we also know about the Japanese internment, and we see all of this kind of hate mongering in the current moment with the language coming out of the Biden administration. And of course, it's impossible not to notice the epidemic of attacks against Asians. We can't blame this on Trump because they're happening outside of the Trumposphere. This is an image of a series of Buddhas that have been desecrated in Vancouver. The UK itself has had a 300% spike in hate crimes. And of course, we can see that they've continued to spike after Donald Trump has been effectively silenced. So these attacks on Asians are inseparable from the racist attacks on China. And as we know, it has resulted in mass shootings and death. My argument would be that a wholesale policy of hate mongering in order to manufacture consent for war trickles down into retail violence. So in your communities, your neighbors, Asians are collateral damage. If you prepare to attack over there, you will get attacks over here. The fat is smoking in the pan. And so we're currently moving towards in a phase of hybrid warfare. And hybrid warfare is a mixture of soft and hard power, state and non-state actors, conventional and non-conventional operations. The US has this belief in full spectrum dominance. All domains are contested and should be controlled, but they also believe in using all the levers of diplomatic, economic, non-conventional warfare. So this is what we call multi-domain warfare. And currently what it looks like is economic and financial warfare against China, tech warfare, legal warfare or lawfare, including the kidnapping of Chinese executives, diplomatic warfare, military brinksmanship, civil subversion, as we saw in Hong Kong, and academic warfare. So the total information warfare is largely around human rights abuses, genocide, Chinese made and released COVID, China's destroying the planet. The upshot is that China is a threat to the world. So as we know, in war, the first casualty is truth. Information warfare always precedes kinetic shooting war. We have to understand why the US is at war with China. It goes back to Martin Luther King's three evils. In 1949, China stood up. This resulted in a wave of xenophobia that we now know referred to as McCarthyism. And then during the Nixon era, there was a slight thaw in relations. And after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989, the hawks, the China hawks came back. Key among this was a man called Andrew Marshall, who was the model for Dr. Strangelove. And Daniel Ellsberg has said that Dr. Strangelove is actually a documentary, it's not fiction. But anyway, Andrew Marshall was the top advisor to 12 secretaries of defense. He ran the Office of Net Assessment for 42 years, the Pentagon's internal think tank. And he had two obsessions. One was US military supremacy, and the other was preventing China's rise to power. These are some of his mentees, the people that he mentored into power. You may recognize some of them: Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, Krapinovich, Pillsbury, Herman Kahn, Richard Pearl. And of course, his key acolyte, Paul Wolfowitz, penned the 1992 Defense Guidance Planning document, which was a plan to dominate the world. This was disavowed because it was so embarrassing when it was leaked, but it became the project for the new American century. And it has a plan for full spectrum dominance, unipolar global dominance. And it explicitly mentions China as a threat. So we can track this policy development from the Defense Planning Guidance document to the Project for a New American Century, to the Bush Doctrine, to the Obama Doctrine, i.e. the pivot to Asia, the Trump Doctrine, and the Biden Doctrine. The pivot to Asia, as you know, was started in 2011. It actually started earlier. The architect of it was Kurt Campbell, and it's essentially a plan to encircle and take down China. It also has at the same time explicit battle doctrine, which is called air-sea battle. And this was put together by Andrew Krapinovich, who was also another acolyte or mentee of Andrew Marshall. Now, there also at the same time another group called the Blue Team. And these were people who are alleging the same things that we're hearing right now. China is a mortal, irreconcilable threat. They're stealing military secrets, slave labor, etc. And of course, you may recognize some of these Blue Team members. Again, Frank Gaffney, Robert Kagan, Elliot Abrams, John Bolton. I think you know these people. And also not to forget Nancy Pelosi, who was part of this Blue Team. And so these people, essentially they're neocons, said that there was no hope of coexistence with China. And they have been building foreign policy for decades, which is preparing for war with China. Now, to understand the geopolitics, we have to understand a little bit of the geography. This is a topologist map of the world. That is to say, it shows only connections, not sizes of countries. You can see at the top, China has more connections with other countries than any other country in the world. The top 2/3 is what is called the world island. It's essentially Eurasia and Africa, and it's all connected over land. The bottom third is the Americas, and as you can see, it is separated. The top 2/3 contains most of the world's population, most of the world's wealth, and if it becomes connected, it will become the most powerful region of the planet. This was anticipated by Halford Mackinder in 1904. He said that whoever rules Eurasia commands the heartland, and who rules the heartland, the world island, commands the world. And he referred to the heartland as the pivot state. This is where we get the term pivot to Asia. This was picked up by Brzezinski in his grand chessboard and then reformulated by Paul Wolfowitz into the Defense Planning Guidance document. So we have the heartland theory, pivot state becomes the grand chess game, becomes defense planning guidance, becomes the project for a new American century, which becomes the pivot to Asia. And so China is effectively encircled. As you can see, this is the forces arrayed against China currently right now. You can see that it actually creates a circle or a ring around China. There is a specific plan to take China down called air-sea battle. It's actually based on the USSR battle doctrine, the battle doctrine against the USSR called air-land battle, which was about deep battle extended in time and space, aggressive initiative or aggressive war, and multi-domain integrated battle. And it was never applied against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union collapsed, but it was applied in Gulf War I and all subsequent battles after that. So going back to air-sea battle, it also connects with another document called Thinking Through the Unthinkable, which is a document by Rand, which understands that China is locked in by the South China Sea. There's a bottleneck at the Malacca Straits and through the South China Sea. $5.3 trillion worth of China's goods and trade travels through the South China Sea, and 77% of China's oil. So if the US goes to war with China, it doesn't have to win the war. All it has to do is simply create disruption in trade, and China's economy could reduce by 30%. Rand says that it's best if this happens before 2025. China's response has been to build defensive perimeter, especially in some of the islands of the South China Sea. You can see they're right next to US bases or US potential bases in the Philippines. And Blinken has just said that they see an attack on any Philippine vessels or aircraft that would invoke the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. And this comes as there's massive momentum. There's the G7, NATO, Quad, Five Eyes, which are all accelerating their exercises against China. There are belligerent brinksmanships and phone ops exercises in the South China Sea, and the continual escalation of hybrid warfare. The South China Sea especially is potent for conflict because there's so many overlapping claims. The US actually engineered a legal case against China, which was a form of lawfare. And once again, the war with China would essentially destroy and take down China. Rand suggests that the US should make prudent preparations to enable a long and intense war with China. So again, the other response by China is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is to escape from the sea choke point by doing a long march overland. So this is what we see here, the overland Belt and Road through Myanmar, through Pakistan, through Xinjiang, through Iran, all the way to Western Europe and to Africa. And you'll note that everywhere where there is the Belt and Road Initiative, you'll also see that there's tremendous disturbance, which a lot of it can be traced to US intervention. So there's CMEC, CPEC, Xinjiang, Djibouti, also Lebanon itself was supposed to be a keynote of the Belt and Road until the port was suddenly destroyed. The Belt and Road becomes the physical realization of the heartland. It becomes the pivot state, and it changes the nature of the geopolitical global balance. Taiwan is also a key issue. It's the center of the first island chain of this encirclement. Taiwan is 81 miles from China, and the Bashi Channel is the only deep sea channel that allows China to move from the continental shelf into the deep waters of the Pacific. And the other issue is that Jinmen Island is 3 kilometers from China. This is literally the view from the beach from Jinmen Island in Taiwan. This is how close it is. So you can see that there is massive escalation, there are massive risks, and there's massive hybrid warfare. The US is currently working on what is called the 3rd or 4th offset, which involves autonomous warfare, subsurface warfare, long-range fires, tactical nukes, dispersion and swarming, full spectrum hybrid warfare. The offset strategies, the first offset was really mass. That is, you have a more massive bomb, nuclear bombs against Russia. The second offset was precision. If the other side has nuclear bombs, then you can knock them out with precision guided cruise missiles. The third and fourth offset are a counter against precision, which is dispersion and automated warfare. So the escalation is increasing moment by moment, day by day. Is China a threat? Clearly not. Chinese have not waged a full-scale war outside their borders since 1979. And that was a response against Vietnam's invasion and colonization of Cambodia, which was a Chinese ally. The US during that period has engaged in combat in 66 other nations and has countless interventions and coups. So I want to say we have to organize, educate, act. Despair is not an option. And there's a link to the organization that I work with, peacepivot.org. I also recommend CodeBank, No Cold War, and of course, Veterans for Peace. Thank you so much.
Wow, KJ, that was a lot of material. And as you could tell when KJ was moving between various slides, he has a lot of materials. And one of the questions, KJ, the very first one that came in, and we'll ask you now, because I know you have to scoot on to something else. How will the Veterans for Peace China Working Group leverage the peace veterans' voice to educate the US public against great power conflict with China? If you care, no, I don't know, he may have had to scoot off right then. Well, I can tell you how. And it's how about having KJ come on as a presenter for some of your chapter meetings, or organize with other organizations, the various civic clubs that you have, Rotary, Kiwanis, your church groups, have these presentations, whether it's KJ on China, whether it's Kyle on Hawaii, whether it's Christine on Korea, have these people come on easily by video to give presentations. The next person that we're going to have is from the Western Pacific, and I want to thank her and Lisa Natividad and Vince, who's in Australia, for getting up so early. Lisa is in Guam or Guam right now. She is a professor of social work at the University of Guam. She's also the primary convener of the Guahan Coalition for Peace and Justice. She's an indigenous Chamorro who has championed the exposure of the human rights violations against her people and homeland Guahan, which is a military colony of the United States. She has spoken globally on the topics of demilitarization, decolonialization, and the critical role women play in the creation of safe and thriving communities. She has presented interventions on the halting of the massive military buildup on Guahan before the United Nations Fourth Committee, the Decolonization Committee, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She's a former member of the Guam Decolonization Commission and has spoken on these issues in Japan, the Philippines, the United States, Korea, Norway, Ecuador, Fiji, and other countries. And she was with us on the trip to North Korea with Women Across the DMZ. Please go ahead, Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Anne, and thank you to Veterans for Peace for your invitation. And it's so nice to see familiar faces on this panel, people we've worked with closely. And Vince, it's nice to see you engaged in this US side of the conversation. And so as I get started, I just wanted to share a couple of maps of where I'm from. I'm sure that many of you, having served in the US Armed Forces as Veterans for Peace, are very aware of the context in which I come from Guahan. Oops. Somehow, I'm sorry, hang on, just give me a moment here, get my bearings back because it's jumped slides. But just as a sort of refresher in terms of where we're at on the globe, I wanted to share this. Okay, so this is a general map. This map was actually provided by the Department of Defense folks in one of their briefings on our island. And so I come from Guahan, which is the southernmost island in the Mariana Island chain. To the north of us is the Northern Mariana Islands, who are also indigenous Chamorros, but we are politically divided as a result of our colonial history in the Pacific. And so in the CNMI, to the north, that's where we have the islands of Saipan as well of Tinian, which is very militarily significant in terms of the US's plans in the in the Pacific region. And to the west of us, between Guahan and Manila, we have the islands of Palau, which traditionally is called the Republic of Belao. And so I'll be speaking a little bit about militarization in our three jurisdictions. And so this slide shows a map of our island of Guahan. And as you can see here, it's contextualized again in the region. But I just wanted to point out that to the north, we have Andersen Air Force Base up here. And then over here at Apra Harbor, we have the large naval base. And then we have ongoing construction at the moment, also in the north, round about this area in Retidian, what we call Litekten, of a new base called Camp Blas for purposes of a new Marine base that's being constructed at the moment. And so on Guahan, we are a US territory. And so we don't have full political rights. We don't have the right to vote for president. We elect a congressional representative who doesn't have a true vote in the congressional process. And so as second-class citizens, if you will, our political advocacy has very limited reach in terms of being able to access the decision makers that impact our lives by way of this increased militarization. And so earlier, Kyle spoke about and quoted a Hawaiian activist who talked about the concept of the US military in the Pacific as a he'e, as an octopus, and Hawaii being the brain. And so we clearly are one of the main tentacles in the West Pacific that's connected to this he'e, as we also connect to Australia, to the Koreas, as well as to the different bases in Japan and the Philippines. So having experienced, most people know our island referred to as Guam globally, most commonly, because of our role during World War II. And so clearly our island was active war zone during World War II. We experienced various atrocities. And since then, as is signature to the US and its basing system after war, it generally doesn't leave. And so the US actually came to our island predating that ever since we were spoils of war following the Spanish-American War in 1898. And so having the US military's presence, the war experience and ongoing basis to the present, we experienced the usual toxic contamination of all sorts, PCBs, Agent Orange, purple, red, dioxins, exposure to radiation during nuclear testing times, downwind from the Marshall Islands. And all of these negative experiences in environmental contamination clearly is manifested in our cancer rates and in the health outcomes of our Native people. We experience lots of land dispossession. In the case of our island, the US currently, its footprint primarily for DoD purposes is about 29% of the island. And just to get just to make it clear that this Guam literally is a dot in globes, because we're about 212 square miles, so we're a relatively small place. If you get in a car and drive pretty consistently, you'll be able to circulate the whole island in about 2 hours. And so in addition to that, as with places that have high poverty, we have the economic conscripts and high enlistment rates in the Department of Defense. And so we also are a jurisdiction that has very high rates of death as a result of US wars and participation. So many of you probably have served with Chamorros in the armed forces. In 2006, the US entered into an accord with Japan, talking about the transfer and relocation of Marines. At the time, the figure that was given was 8,900 Marines would be transferred from Okinawa to Guam. Over the years, that figure has changed. It's now closer to 5,000. But as a result of that, there's ongoing construction, additional construction. So I always try to emphasize that not only do we have a baseline of massive military presence, but we have an increase in that with these additional construction projects that are ongoing. And so what's happening primarily now is in the development of Camp Blas is the construction of live firing range in the ancient village of Litekten, which is really problematic for us as Indigenous peoples, largely because of the devastation and desecration of our sacred lands, the exposure of ancestral remains, as well as restrictions in our traditional fishing grounds, as well as limited access to medicinal plants that we need for our traditional medicines that only grow behind military fences because of those conditions there. And so this continues to be problematic. In addition, in the last year, the Sol Hadzun Lagu tree, we have a tree that the only one left of this kind, it's an indigenous and endemic tree to our islands, it's basically slated to be cut down. And so mitigation processes have been ongoing, but the solutions that the US Department of Defense folks bring to the table are grossly insufficient in our eyes. And so transitioning now to talk a little bit about the military exercises that have been ongoing. There's tons of them, particularly in the last couple of months. More specifically, these exercises are displays of air, land, and sea power on our island, as well as connecting to the CNMI, particularly Tinian Island at the moment, as well as to Australia. And so the first of these exercises that commenced in July is referred to as Pacific Iron 2021. We also had just last month, extending into this month, the Army's Pacific Forager 21, and ongoing now are exercises with the British Navy. So we actually have a British ship that's docked here with COVID positive cases. And so these have been ongoing. And so as a result of all of this military activity, there's lots of social tensions between our Native population as well as military members. As a matter of fact, just last week, there were 2 cases of men who were charged with criminal sexual conduct for behavior in the bars committed against women. And so in particular, Pacific Iron 2021, this convenes Air Force commands from Alaska, Idaho, and Hawaii and Japan. There's at least 35 aircraft, many 5th generation stealth fighters that are based in our local airports, as well as in the airport in Tinian Island in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. There's about 10 F-15E Strike Eagles, about 25 F-22 Raptors, 2 C-130 Super Hercules aircraft. and accompanying them about 800 airmen. And this was from mid-July and through the first week of August, primarily based in Guahan and in Tinian. In the case of the Army's Pacific Forager 21, there was about 4,000 personnel and troops. And so part of the ridiculous hyper-militarization that's been happening on our island has resulted in us having to coexist with these very damaging military exercises that are posturing for war preparation. And as you can see with the example I gave of the social impacts, really creates big problems for us. And so looking to the west of our island over here to the Republic of Belau, recently, as a matter of fact, including this month, the president of Belau, President Whips Jr., has had talks with the US Secretary of Defense. They've been discussing the Indo-Pacific security concerns. Part of the reasons for these talks as well is because the current president is very aligned with the US ideology as opposed to previous presidents. In the case of Palau, they became an independent country in 1981, and in 1994 entered into a Compact of Free Association with the United States. Part of the Compact of Free Association specifically indicates that they would be available and accessible for military activity. And Palau is also very noted for the fact that in its constitution, they have a clause that's an anti-nuclear clause, not allowing nuclear activities in their water in their country. However, because of the US's COFA insistence, they were granted an exception to that in the Constitution. There's about 500 Palauans in the US Department of Defense who serve. And Palau is seen, the sort of sales pitch, if you will, from the latest meeting with Palau was to promote a free, open, and secure region. So Palau currently hosts US forces since 1970, although as far as I understand, there isn't a full base there. So it's really more in and out kind of and exercises that occurs there. They do deploy equipment and exercises on joint capability and what they refer to as enhanced deterrence. And so through the leadership of Palau's eyes, they see the military presence as deterrence, as well as opportunities for economic investment. And in small island nations like Palau, the vulnerability of the economy makes the US military actually a very popular customer, if you will, to their home. And so how can you help? And I'm just kind of preempting this question because I know it blew up in the chat with everyone else. One thing to consider when you're talking about people from Belau, from Guahan, from the CNMI, is that because we are not US states, we really do lack the political power in Congress to be able to advocate for our resistance to these military activities and exercises and presence on our homelands. And so that lobbying assistance really is very helpful for us. And so in closing, I just wanted to say that, you know, as our Hawaiian brother from activists has illustrated with the he'e, right? And the need to really kind of deconstruct it from its head. I think when we all work together in these kinds of fashion and ways, that it really does help us to be able to gain some traction, to learn more about militarism and its impacts, and ultimately to be able to stand up against and resist the future development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That is a remarkable presentation and of all of the things that are going on in and around Guahan. You all are littered, overwhelmed with US military. And it's when you start listing the numbers of aircraft that have flown in there. I know here in the Honolulu paper, we do get a roundup of like 22 aircraft have now just flown to Guahan. There's aircraft coming in from Alaska, from all of these places. And when you think about all of the military ships that are coming through, the aircraft carriers and the carrier groups that are in the South China Sea, it is a very dangerous place that you are in. We thank you for alerting us to that. And another dangerous place with lots and lots of US military, unfortunately, is to the south of Guahan, down in Australia. And Dr. Vince Scapatura, who's a professor of politics and international relations at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. He's written extensively on the US corporate lobby and on Australian defense policies. he's going to tell us about the second largest war maneuver in the Pacific, which is going on right now in Australia. Please, Vince, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's a pleasure to be with you all and to be amongst such esteemed colleagues. I'll just make a small correction. I'm a lecturer in politics and international relations, not quite professor yet, not that esteemed. Yes, soon to come. I'm just going to share my screen because I have a quick presentation I'd like to show. Hopefully you can see that okay? Yep,
yes, we can.
Wonderful. So thank you. It's lovely to see some familiar faces, particularly Lisa. It's lovely to see you again. A big shout out to you. Hopefully we can see each other in person sometime when this terrible pandemic is over. So I'm presenting to you from Sydney, Australia, as Anne mentioned, and I would actually like to begin by first acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm presenting to you today, the Darramurrugal or Darug people. And I would like to extend my respect to their elders, past, present, and future. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty in this country was never ceded by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So given the limited time that I have, I'm not by any means going to give a kind of a comprehensive presentation on the way in which Australia is integrated into US global military and intelligence networks, which is quite extensive. Instead, I thought I'd focus on one particular aspect of this relationship by focusing on the Australia-US Talisman Sabre military exercises, which Anne mentioned have only just concluded. So I'll begin by giving a brief introduction to the exercises, where they're held, the scale of the exercises, who participates, what the stated and understated objectives of the exercises are. And I'll be focusing on the recent exercises that have just happened, but also with reference to some past exercises too. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the significant weapon systems and platforms and maneuvers that have been utilized in recent years at the exercises. Many of them are first in this year's exercises, as well as some of the new operational concepts that are being experimented with, particularly some of that have already been mentioned in KJ's presentation. All of which I'm going to argue points to the war games not merely being an exercise in order to maintain the general objectives of interoperability and mutual defense preparedness as advertised, but rather as a signal to China specifically of the capacity of the US and its allies to encircle it militarily and to maintain US military dominance and power projection capabilities throughout the Indo-Pacific. Okay, so Talisman Sabre is indeed the largest bilateral military exercise between the US and Australia. It takes place every 2 years on land in northern and eastern Australia, but also in the waters off the coast of Australia's eastern coast. Just to give you a sense of the scale of the exercises, they hit a peak in 2019 of over 34,000 Australian and US forces, which was the largest number of forces involved in the exercises since they began in 2005. In recent years, they've typically focused on high-end warfighting, including air combat, strategic bombing simulations, amphibious assaults, anti-submarine warfare, urban operations, and so on. The exercises include all the traditional domains of warfare, so air, maritime, and land, but also some of the more recent domains, again, that KJ mentioned in his presentation: information, intelligence, cyber, electronic warfare, hybrid warfare. And also for the first time this year, and indeed for the first time in any international exercise, as I understand it, there was the participation of the US Space Force Task Group. It's also worth mentioning that the United States already has a 2,500 strong Marine Air Ground Task Force that permanently rotates through Darwin in Northern Australia every year as part of a basing arrangement that was agreed to in 2011 as part of the already mentioned Obama administration's pivot to Asia. And those Marines also participate in Talisman Sabre. Incidentally, there have been reports in the Australian media that those Marines based in Darwin may soon double in number, potentially up to 5,000 in the not too distant future. There are some discussions going on, it seems, although nothing's confirmed. This year there was a reduced presence at Talisman Sabre due to COVID-19 restrictions. So 17,000 forces participated in total from 7 different nations. I also think a factor in the reduced presence was the fact that the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier, which generally participates in the war games in the past, was redeployed to Afghanistan to support the withdrawal of forces there. So that may have been a factor apart from COVID-19. So you can see from the slide there that the vast majority of forces are made up from the US and Australia, but nevertheless, there is participation from several regional allies and partners of the US who together carried out a number of multilateral maneuvers. So, for example, you had Australian and Japanese forces undertake major amphibious assault exercises together with the US and other nations for the first time in Talisman Sabre 2019. Prior to that, Japan had only ever sent a very small contingent of troops embedded with US Marines, but more recently they've ramped up their participation with the destroyers and amphibious troops and so on. And in Talisman Sabre this year, South Korea joined the exercises for the first time. So although smaller in number, the increasing participation of other countries in the Talisman Sabre exercises, I think, does carry significance, not least of which is in terms of the signal it sends about the readiness, if not the willingness, of US regional partners to participate in a US-led regional conflict. So, although it's not emphasized, it's no secret that Talisman Sabre, along with numerous other multilateral exercises the US undertakes in the region every year, in many cases with the participation of Australian forces. And as we've heard from the other panel speakers, these are not merely about improving the general readiness and interoperability of the US and its allies, or even strengthening, in Australia's case, the US alliance in order to defend Australia should it come under some remote and unlikely chance of attack, but rather for the specific purpose of preparing for war with China in its air and maritime approaches in the South China Sea. The particular weapons platforms and systems, along with some of the new operational concepts that are being tested at Talisman Sabre, and indeed across the entire Indo-Pacific, are specifically developed for what US Army doctrine describes as the need to penetrate and disintegrate China's protective bubble that extends out from its shoreline and up to the first island chain. China has created this bubble, which is technically referred to as a area access, area denial, or A2AD system, as a result of significant advancements in missile capabilities, thereby undermining the capacity of the US to project its military power uncontested in China's territory and near territories and in its air and maritime approaches. And the larger strategy that this particular doctrine fits into is the strategy that KJ so eloquently described. But I'm going to give a few examples of these particular weapon systems and maneuvers that have been deployed in Talisman Sabre in a moment, just to give you an idea of what they are. But in short, the point here is that the exercises are primarily aimed at shoring up American power projection capabilities in order to defend American primacy or military dominance in Asia. And if anyone needed any further evidence of the fact that the exercises are specifically directed at China, one need only turn to the remarks of one of Australia's former defence officials who quipped recently that the presence of 2 Chinese spy ships that were detected off Australia's coast during the war games this year only helped to make the exercises more realistic. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'd like to highlight some of the examples of weapon systems and platforms and maneuvers that were undertaken in Talisman Sabre in recent years, and some, in fact, that have been undertaken for the first time this year. And I would like to point to their significance in terms of signaling or indeed preparations for a US-China war. So firstly, this year, US B-52 strategic bomber participated in the Talisman Sabre exercises. It's not unusual for B-52s to engage in training exercises with Australian forces, especially since the Enhanced Air Cooperation Initiative commenced in 2017, which facilitates the rotation of US air elements in Northern Australia and training exercises between the US Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force. So, for example, under that initiative, US B-1B bombers have recently flown to Australia from Guahan, undertaking bombing simulations while being refueled by Australian airborne fuel tankers. But in this case, in Talisman Sabre 2021, a B-52 bomber was first deployed from North Dakota, I believe, flew non-stop to Anderson Air Base in Guahan before flying non-stop again to Australia to undertake a series of simulated bombing runs in Queensland with targets that were acquired by US but also Allied forces. As US Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Roy Loesch explained, Talisman Sabre, quote, offers a unique opportunity for our strategic bomber force to prepare for the challenges of power projection across the vast distances of the Indo-Pacific. That particular B-52 was later joined by several Australian aircraft in a number of sophisticated maneuvers based on combined training over many months and years to demonstrate interoperability between Australian and US forces, but also significantly, again, according to Loesch, to, quote, send a clear message presumably to China, that we can and will fight together as a team. Another significant maneuver, and first for Australian forces at least, was the lead role taken by the Australian Defence Force in an amphibious assault exercise. So Talisman Sabre 2019 was in fact the first time since World War II Australian forces led a beach assault, drawing on the knowledge and experience of the US Marines. A combined expeditionary strike group, which included Australian, US, UK, and New Zealand, and as I mentioned before, Japanese forces, simulated the liberation of a small Pacific island after it had been invaded by a fictional Pacific nation. You can guess who the fictional adversary represented. It's no secret that one of the flashpoints for a potential US-China war are disputed islands in the South and East China Seas. Now, while the images of Australian and US forces, Marines storming beaches in Australia generally kind of capture the headlines here in the news, the most innovative part of Talisman Sabre exercises recently have actually been happening inland, where Australian and US forces have been testing out the US Army's new and evolving multi-domain operations concept. So again, KJ kind of explained the broader purpose and function of these new operational concepts, and particularly the hybridized information war elements. But the part that I want to focus on is the part of MDO which involves quickly maneuvering potentially dozens but small and highly lethal formations armed with long-range precision missile systems from island to island across the Pacific as part of a strategy for penetrating China's protective A2AD missile bubble that I spoke of earlier, thereby presenting China's forces with what the US Army refers to as multiple dilemmas, thereby opening up corridors for more significant and larger US power projection forces to exploit. The US Marines, in fact, have their own related concept, which is similar to the US Army, once again operating small and highly maneuverable forces armed with long-range precision fires within what they call China's weapons engagement zone. For those who are familiar with the INF Treaty, which limited the range of ground-based missiles, the primary reason the Trump administration pulled out of that arms agreement with Russia was so that the US could station ground-based medium to long-range missiles around China in support of these new operational concepts. So during Talisman Sabre exercises, both in 2019 and this year, the US Army deployed its relatively new multi-domain task force. Apparently, the Army has plans to build 5 of these new task forces in the coming years, along with a truck-mounted HIMARS, or High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, which is pictured on the slide. So the HIMARS was used during these exercises in a complex maneuver with a crucial command and control role for the Australian Defence Force. That was a preview in miniature of the kind of multi-domain operations the US Army envisions in a future war against China. The HIMARS is in fact the central weapons platform that both the US Army and the Marines intend to deploy as part of these new operational doctrines against China. After President Trump pulled out of the INF treaty, Lockheed Martin was contracted to provide a new precision strike missile for the HIMARS to extend its range from around 300 kilometers to potentially over 1,000. And Australia is in fact looking to purchase the HIMARS as part of a huge a $100 billion investment over 20 years into longer range missile capabilities. And actually, just a few days ago, it was reported here in the Australian media that Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced that Australia was partnering with the US and Lockheed Martin in the next phase of the development of the precision strike missile as part of a plan to equip the Australian Defence Force with land-based guided missiles. This year, during Talisman Sabre, a Royal Australian Air Force C-17A Globemaster III was the first non-US aircraft to provide rapid air mobility to the HIMARS. So the exercise demonstrated how a C-17A could land, offload one or two of these HIMARS, fire the weapons, roll back onto the C-17A, and take off again before an enemy could determine its location, apparently all within below 45 minutes. An Australian commanding officer of the Royal Australian Air Force noted that the exercise further established how the Royal Australian Air Force could integrate with the US Armed Forces in the future. Okay, so I'm just going to end by quoting an influential report produced by the Centre for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in 2003, a Washington-based national security think tank, which presented a warning of the kinds of future anti-access area denial capabilities that exercises like Talisman Sabre are today working to defeat. The report presciently warned that there is ample reason to anticipate that future adversaries, having seen Iraq routed twice by US-led coalition forces after they were allowed to deploy unmolested into Southwest Asia, will seek asymmetric ways of opposing the movement of US military forces into their region. A2 and AD capabilities are therefore a natural and logical response to American military preeminence and demonstrated power projection capabilities. The report goes on immediately to cite China's budding missile capabilities as an indicator of the kind of A2-AD threat that the US will one day have to confront. In other words, it's another reminder that the Talisman Sabre exercises are not really about security, but rather feed the cycle of insecurity that derives from at least 2 decades of American displays of unconstrained military power across the Indo-Pacific and indeed the globe. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vince. That is a sobering account of the U.S. military putting into action some of its newest operational theories. You know, the U.S. military, the services in the military are really undergoing quite a change. The U.S. Marine Corps has said, we don't want those big, heavy tanks anymore. We want to be lean, mean, mobile. We want our own set of boats that can take us to these small islands where they will meet up with the U.S. Army, who has also said, well, wait a minute, we want those islands. We want to send our people there, and we want our own little aircraft that can land them there. So, you know, this is really causing quite a rivalry between the U.S. military services as they readjust what their missions ought to be. And of course, it costs lots of money to readjust. And the US taxpayer is certainly seeing that. We apologize again for US military on Australia, US military on Guam, and of course, here in Hawaii. We do have a couple of questions, and Colleen has mentioned that we can go a few minutes over just to get a few questions answered. Kyle, I see that there are several questions on Hawaii that have been brought up in the chat. Would you like to cover some of them, particularly on the leasing, releasing, or extension of leases?
Sure, but I didn't, I missed it. So could you repeat them? Or
yeah, just kind of a status and what is going on to try to challenge the releasing of lands.
So right now, the Army is undergoing an environmental impact review under the National Environmental Policy Act. One for Pohakuloa training area began last year, and it's in the phase of drafting an environmental impact statement that should be released maybe next year, and there'll be time for people to comment on it and so forth. And the right now it's an open period for the Oahu leases. So there's 3 sites on Oahu that they're beginning the scoping process for an environmental impact statement. So this is where you give input into the kinds of impacts and questions that the study should incorporate. And so we just had a series of public meetings where almost 100% opposition to the renewal of the lease. And if anyone would like to submit comments, it is an open period until September 1st. Going into the future, I think, you know, we will probably have other protests, and we'll have to kind of run this process out. But I think there may be legal challenges along the way, and possibly nonviolent actions in the future. And so at that point, if there are folks that would like to come to Hawaii and join us in some action, we'd love to have the solidarity. Yeah, so that's where that's at right now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then Vince, we have a question for you on what is the level of anti-war activism and activism against these military exercises in Australia? And Vince, you're muted.
Hi, can you hear me? Sorry, you were cutting out a little bit.
Yes, we're just asking about the level of citizen activism against these military exercises.
Yes, right. Yeah, I saw the question. I did answer it in the chat, but I'll answer it live as well. So yeah, there is a lively peace movement in Australia. And if you would like to check it out, look at the website ipan.org.au, which is the website for the Independent Peaceful Australia Network. And that's an umbrella organization for peace organizations all across the country. There's actually a public inquiry, which IPAN is running at the moment. Submissions are closing soon, but it's a public inquiry into the costs and consequences of Australia's alliance with the United States. And I can post the link to that in the chat. Obviously, it's mainly directed at an Australian audience, but we'd love to have submissions from an international audience as well to get an international perspective on the damaging costs of Australia's relationship with the United States. So I definitely would encourage people to make submissions. So I can put that link into the chat.
Thank you. And then a last question, and this is for Lisa. Could you kind of give us a rundown of what organizations there are in the Western Pacific that are kind of regional organizations that are challenging the U.S. militarization of the region?
That's a great question, but in truth, there isn't an umbrella regional organization that we have. In the past, there was the NFIP, the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific, that we were very active with. But that's kind of defunct at the moment, although there's some sub-chapters in some places. I know Hawaii has one, but not one in Micronesia. But on island, we do have Protege Letegzin, Save Retidian. In the CNMI, there's a couple of organizations, Protectors of Ghani, as well as Commonwealth. So that's the second one. Palau, unfortunately, their movement was very vibrant during the time of the COFA negotiations. But of late, what we do whenever we want to connect is we meet with those that have carried on the work of those women, because it was primarily women in Palau who resisted the nuclear clause. So.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, and Kyle put in the chat that there is the Pacific Peace Network that's kind of now trying to bring organizations from all over the Pacific together that has sponsored several webinars now. And Vince mentioned the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network. Then the women's organization for genuine security that has been around for quite a while, that still is there. We do know that in the Philippines, there are a variety of organizations that are challenging the U.S. military in terms of particularly violence against women, and the same in Okinawa. And in Korea, we do have a huge number of organizations affiliated with the Korea Peace Now network and other networks. And of course, Jeju Island is one of the great activist places in the whole world, one of the places where a new military base has been built. In Japan, on Okinawa, as we mentioned, there's so much opposition in Okinawa to the US military bases there. And then on the mainland of Japan, we now have several groups that we now know of because of Chapter 34 of the New York chapter that have sponsored several webinars with peace groups on the mainland of Japan. So there's a lot of groups out there. There are a lot of there are a lot of resources that we at Veterans for Peace can access to educate our communities and to be you know, a real mover within our community of talking about the dangers that are going on out in the Western Pacific and Asia. So let me just check our panelists one more time to see if anyone has a last comment they'd like to make. Well, I guess not. And what I want to do is to thank everybody, all the panelists, for sure, for your wonderful presentations. You all are great experts, and we appreciate your time here. And we appreciate the over 100 people that have joined in on this plenary session for the excellent Veterans for Peace virtual convention. So with that, we want to thank everyone, and we'll see you in another session with Veterans for Peace Convention. Please go ahead and sign in to the next set of webinars that we have. Thank you so much. Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.